My name is Cale Renson, and for 6 years I was property, not a slave in chains, nothing so simple. I was an indentured worker aboard the vessel Thessarin, a living ship that belonged to the Ethra hive, a species of tall, insect-like beings who moved like water and thought like a single mind spread across 1,000 bodies. My grandfather had signed the debt papers after Earth lost a war we never should have fought. I inherited the debt like a family heirloom. I was told I would serve for 10 years and then be free. I was on year 6. I cleaned corridors. I repaired wiring too delicate for their clawed hands. I carried things too heavy for their thin limbs, but too simple for their automated drones to bother with. I was useful in the way a broom is useful. Nobody thanked a broom. The Ethra were not cruel to me. That would have required them to think of me as something worth being cruel to. Mostly, they simply did not see me. I would walk past a group of them discussing ship business, and they would speak as if I were a wall with legs. I got used to it. I told myself it did not matter. A man can tell himself many things when he has no other choice. The ship itself was beautiful, in a strange way. It did not have metal hulls like the ships I grew up dreaming about as a boy on Earth. It had hulls that pulsed faintly, like the inside of something alive, because the Thessarin technically was alive, grown from a single seed vessel over 100 years, layer by layer, the way a shell grows around a pearl. At the very center of the ship, deep in the lowest levels, was the Queen's chamber. I had been there only once, to fix a broken light panel, and I remembered it perfectly. Row after row of soft, glowing pods, each one holding a Ethra child not yet born. Thousands of them. The future of an entire species, sleeping in the dark. I never thought I would see that chamber again. I never thought I would be the one standing between it and destruction. It happened on a day that started like any other. I was polishing the observation deck windows, an old-fashioned human way of doing it, with cloth and solution, because the Ethra found my methods quaint and let me keep doing it that way, when the alarms began. Not the gentle warning chimes I had heard before during minor system checks. These were different, deep, urgent. The whole ship seemed to shudder, like something enormous had struck it from outside. I dropped my cloth and ran toward the nearest crew corridor, following the sound of hurried footsteps and clicking voices. Through a viewport, I caught a glimpse of the cause. A storm of ionized debris, the remains of a shattered moon, or perhaps a battle long past, tearing through space directly into our path. The Thessarin was old, her shields were not what they used to be. Evacuation, a voice announced through the ship's speakers, in the clicking Ethra language I had learned to understand over the years. All citizens to launch pods immediately. I moved toward the nearest evacuation bay, joining the flow of tall, fast-moving bodies. Nobody looked at me. Nobody spoke to me. I told myself that was normal. I told myself I would find a spot on a pod once the officers finished their counts. I was wrong. When I reached the bay, the doors were already sealing. I banged on the thick glass, shouting, but the Ethra inside were focused on their checklists, their sensors, their own kind. A young Ethra official glanced at a screen, and I heard him say, quite calmly, to another, "All registered citizens accounted for." Registered citizens. Not me. I had never been registered as anything but cargo. The pod doors sealed. Through the glass, I watched dozens of escape vessels detach from the Thessarin and streak away into the dark, leaving trails of pale light behind them like 100 shooting stars. I stood there, alone in an empty corridor, listening to the alarms scream, and I understood, with a strange and terrible clarity, that I had been left behind. For a moment, I will admit, I was afraid. Not the kind of fear that makes you shout or cry, but the quiet kind, the kind that settles into your chest and makes everything very still. I thought about my mother back on Earth, who did not know where I was most days. I thought about the 10 years I still owed. I thought, absurdly, about how I had left my cleaning cloth on the observation deck. Then, I made myself move. If I was going to be alone on a dying ship, I decided I would rather die trying to do something than sit and wait for the end to find me. I made my way toward the nearest emergency terminal, hoping to find a way to signal for rescue, or perhaps locate an escape pod that had been overlooked. That was when I felt it. A deep, low tremor beneath my feet, followed by a sound like a great creature groaning in pain. The ship's internal systems flickered. Emergency lights turned from white to a dim, pulsing red. I checked a wall panel. one of the few written in a script I had taught myself to read over the years, and my stomach dropped. Core breach. Lower deck 7. Life support failing. Lower deck 7 was where the Queen's chamber sat, where the unhatched young slept in their rows of soft light. I stood frozen for only a second. Then I ran. The corridors leading down were dark and unfamiliar, lit only by the weak red emergency glow. Twice I had to force open doors that had lost power, using nothing but a metal bar I found along the way, and every bit of strength in my arms. The ship groaned around me constantly now, like it knew it was dying and wanted the whole universe to hear it. When I finally reached the chamber, I stopped in the doorway, breathless. It was worse than I feared. The soft glowing light I remembered was flickering, dimming in patches like a candle running out of wax. The gentle hum that had once filled the room, the sound of thousands of small hearts beginning to form, had turned uneven, stuttering. Thin trails of vapor leaked from cracked support tubes along the ceiling. The temperature was dropping. I could see my own breath. I was not a doctor. I was not an engineer. I was a man who fixed wiring and polished glass. But I understood, in that moment, that if the temperature dropped any further, or if the air support failed completely, everything in that room would be lost within the hour. I could have left. Some small, tired part of my mind reminded me that I owed these people nothing. They had left me to die without a second thought. Nobody would have blamed me for finding a way to save only myself, if such a way even existed. But I looked at those rows of pods, dim and flickering, and I thought of them not as Yithra Young or the Queen's brood, but simply as children, small, sleeping, and completely unable to save themselves. I could not walk away from that. I have never been able to walk away from that. So I got to work. I did not know the Yithra systems the way their engineers did, but I had spent 6 years learning how things worked, regardless of who built them. Every system, alien or human, obeys the same basic rules. Power must flow somewhere. Heat must go somewhere. Air must be pushed and pulled by something. I found the coolant lines first, tracing them with my hands along the wall, until I found the crack that was leaking the ship's vital fluid into the air. I tore a strip of cloth from my sleeve and packed it tightly into the gap, then wrapped wire around it as hard as my fingers could manage. It was not a real repair. It was a bandage. But bandages buy time, and time was the only thing I had to offer. Next came the power. The main line to the chamber had been damaged somewhere upstream, but I found a secondary line still humming with a weak charge, one meant for lighting rather than life support. It took me almost 20 minutes, sweating in the freezing air, to reroute the wiring by hand, splicing cables the way I had learned as a boy fixing my father's old equipment back on Earth. When the lights in the chamber steadied, brightening from their dying flicker into a low, stable glow, I nearly wept with relief. But the air was still thinning. I searched the chamber walls until I found an emergency reserve tank, heavy and awkward, built for Yithra strength rather than mine. I do not fully remember how I moved it. I only remember pushing with everything I had, my legs shaking, my lungs burning in the cold thin air, until it clicked into place, and a soft hiss filled the room. Oxygen, flowing back into the chamber. I sat down after that, right there on the freezing floor, surrounded by thousands of small glowing pods, and I laughed. It was not a happy laugh. It was the laugh of a man who could not quite believe he was still breathing. In the quiet that followed, I found myself talking to them. The unhatched young, I mean. I do not know why. Perhaps it was simply to hear a voice, even my own, in that vast, silent room. "You don't know me," I said, my breath fogging in the cold. "And I don't know you. But I'm not going to let you freeze in the dark. Nobody deserves that. Not even the children of people who forgot I existed." I kept talking as I worked, checking the systems again and again, tightening what I could, watching the temperature slowly, painfully climb back toward safe. I told them, absurdly, about Earth, about the color of the sky there, and the sound of rain, and how strange it was that I had traveled across the galaxy, only to end up alone, in a room full of strangers, who could not understand a single word I said. It was during one of these quiet checks that I found the ship's old distress beacon, buried beneath a service panel, unused because the Thessarin's main communication system had failed, along with everything else. It took me nearly an hour, with cold fingers and a mind running on nothing but stubbornness, to get it working. When the beacon finally activated, sending its signal out into the dark, I allowed myself, for the first time, to hope. I do not know how long I waited after that. Time moves strangely when you are alone and exhausted and unsure if help is coming. I stayed in the chamber, watching over the pods, listening to their steady, restored hum, until I heard something through the ship's hull that I will remember for the rest of my life. The deep vibration of another vessel docking. The Ithra who came through those doors were not the same officials who had sealed the evacuation bay behind me. These were rescue crews, drawn back by the beacon I had restored, and behind them, moving with a grace and urgency I had never seen from her kind before, was the Queen herself. She stopped in the doorway. Her many eyes moved slowly across the room, the steady lights, the working systems, the rows of pods glowing warm and safe, and then, finally, to me, sitting exhausted on the cold floor, in my torn servant's uniform, surrounded by wire and cloth and the small tools of a man who refused to give up. She did not speak, not right away. The Ithra do not show emotion the way humans do, and I did not expect her to fall to her knees in gratitude. But something in the way she looked at me told me she understood exactly what had happened, and exactly who had done it. I stood up slowly, my legs aching, and I did not look away. "They forgot me," I said quietly, not entirely sure if she could understand my language, or if she needed to. But I didn't forget them. Whatever happened after that day, and much did happen, more than I ever expected, one thing had changed forever. I was no longer invisible. I was no longer a wall with legs, a broom left in a corner, a debt to be paid and forgotten. I was the one who stayed, the one who fought in the cold and the dark for lives that were never mine to save, simply because I could not imagine doing anything else. They had abandoned the human servant. They never made that mistake again.